What mysterious power lets a mother's tears cross despair and awaken hope, gently transforming a wandering heart in ways unseen? Welcome, dear listener. Wherever you may be tonight, perhaps resting quietly or preparing for sleep, join me, subscribe if you wish, and let us begin this gentle journey together now. This is the story of Saint Monica, a mother who carried her son Augustine through long years of prayer and tears, showing how perseverance can soften a resistant heart and allow grace to reshape a wandering life in God's time. And so, from the soft glow of that opening question and the quiet invitation into this shared moment, the story begins to unfold in the warm light of early memory, where the first traces of a young girl named Monica emerge like dawn, rising over the hills of North Africa. In the small town of Tagaste, where olive trees bent gently in the breeze and the dust of Roman roads settled slowly each evening, Monica entered the world surrounded by a rhythm of ordinary life that would one day give shape to extraordinary holiness. Her family was Christian at a time when many still clung to older beliefs, and it was within those walls that she learned her earliest lessons of patience, generosity, and the sacred hush of prayer. There was nothing grand about her house, nothing that foretold sainthood, yet grace often hides itself in quiet beginnings, and perhaps it was in that hiddenness that Monica first understood how the smallest seeds can grow into sturdy roots. She grew up under the attentive care of parents who valued discipline and integrity, and they placed in her hands responsibilities that felt heavier than simple childhood tasks. Yet even as a girl, she carried them with a seriousness that made her elders pause. She learned the rhythm of the household, the weaving of cloth, the tending of food, the offering of small kindnesses to neighbors who passed by the doorway. When disputes arose, she was the one who seemed able to listen a moment longer, to choose gentleness where others chose haste, to wait for tempers to cool rather than push back with equal force. This instinct for peace would become one of the greatest marks of her later life. But even then, as a child, it glimmered quietly like a lamp tucked beneath a humble roof. There were moments, of course, when she struggled with her own impulses, for no childhood is free from the natural tug of impatience or mischief. But each time she faltered, she returned with an almost surprising readiness to begin again. An elderly servant woman in the household, who had nursed her father before her, noticed this tendency and took it upon herself to guide Monica with soft correction. She taught her how to pray slowly, letting each word settle like dew, how to choose silence rather than answer too quickly, how to listen for the still, small voice beneath life's noise. These lessons were not dramatic. They were built from repetition, practice, and the simple awareness that holiness often begins not with great deeds but with small acts performed faithfully. As Monica grew into adolescence, she developed a natural sense of self-possession, a gracefulness of spirit that caught the attention of those around her. She was steady, gentle, and unhurried in a world where many rushed to prove themselves. In the marketplace, she was known for her courteous manner, offering a respectful greeting even to those who approached her with little kindness. In her home, she became the quiet balance to family tensions, often soothing misunderstandings before they grew into wounds. And all the while, she nurtured within herself a quiet devotion, rising early to offer the first minutes of the day to God and ending evenings with a whisper of gratitude. Those simple gestures created an inner sanctuary that no hardship could easily disturb. Yet beneath the surface of this peaceful upbringing, Monica was learning something far more profound: the art of perseverance. Life in Tagaste was not without hardship. Seasons could be harsh, illnesses common, and daily uncertainties weighed heavily upon families dependent on harvests and trade. Monica saw sorrow brush across the lives of her neighbors, widows mourning, parents anxiously waiting for news of children serving far away, workers returning home weary from long days. She felt within herself a growing conviction that every life carried its own cross, and that the path of faith was walked step by patient step. She observed her parents endure trials with dignity, never allowing bitterness to take root. These early experiences deepened her understanding of endurance, shaping a heart that would one day bear immense suffering without losing hope. In these years, she also discovered the beauty of Scripture, which was read aloud during gatherings of the small Christian community. She listened carefully to stories of steadfast women, of Hannah who prayed for her child, of the mothers who followed Christ even to the foot of the cross. She felt a quiet stirring, a recognition that faith was not merely a set of practices, but a relationship rooted in trust. And though she could not yet imagine the challenges that awaited her, she instinctively drew strength from these voices across time, sensing that their perseverance would one day speak into her own life. Her parents, seeing her maturity, began to entrust her with greater responsibilities, caring for younger siblings, assisting with guests, helping settle minor household disputes. Each task taught her something about human nature, about the fragile balance between flaws and goodness, about how words spoken in haste might wound, while words spoken with humility might heal. Though she was still young, these experiences strengthened her capacity to bear burdens quietly and to see beyond the surface of another's actions. Such understanding would later sustain her through the storms of marriage and motherhood, when she would need every trace of compassion she had stored in her heart. There were evenings when she sat beneath the fading light of the North African sky, watching the last colors slip behind the hills. In those moments, she allowed herself a kind of gentle contemplation, wondering what shape her future would take, what responsibilities might await her, and whether she would have the courage to endure whatever God might place in her path. Though she did not yet know her vocation, she sensed that the path ahead would not be simple. But even in her youth, she felt no fear. Instead, there was a quiet readiness, a willingness to say yes, to hold steady, to trust that God would guide her through every season. As childhood gave way to young adulthood, Monica began stepping into a new chapter of life, one that would soon pull her into a marriage that tested every virtue she possessed. Yet the qualities formed in her earliest years, the patience learned beside her mother, the prayer nurtured in quiet mornings, the compassion shaped through daily acts of service, would become the foundation upon which she would build her future. For every saint's journey begins long before the moments history remembers, and Monica's path was being prepared gently, slowly, as if grace were laying each stone with loving intention. And so the first stage of her story settles softly here, like evening dew upon familiar ground, reminding us that great holiness often begins in unremarkable places, shaped by ordinary days, quiet lessons, and the simple desire to love well. What hidden strength was she already carrying without yet knowing its future demand? And so, from the gentle close of the first chapter of Monica's life, where childhood settled like the final light of an untroubled day, the story moves quietly forward into the years when a young woman steps out of innocence and learns what it means to carry responsibility in her own name. These were not dramatic years in appearance. There were no grand events, no sudden revelations, no celebrations that announced her entry into adulthood. Instead, they unfolded as life often does in quiet towns, through a gradual deepening of duties, a widening of the heart, and the slow realization that one's character is shaped not by rare moments of triumph, but by the steady weight of everyday choices. Monica, now growing into womanhood, felt that weight settling upon her with a seriousness she embraced rather than resisted, though she could not yet see how essential these lessons would become to her future trials. In those early adult years, she remained in her family home, continuing the rhythms she had learned as a child, but now with greater expectation placed upon her. Household work took on new meaning, not merely as tasks to be completed, but as a form of service that revealed the hidden threads binding a family together. She learned to cook for large gatherings, to organize stores of grain and oil, to tend to the linens that draped the small prayer corner her family kept in honor of the Lord. These responsibilities were not glamorous, but for Monica, they were formative. She began to understand that holiness grew not only in moments of prayer, but also in the careful folding of garments, the gentleness of tending to an illness, the quiet resolve to treat every member of the household with patience, even when tempers ran high. As her parents aged, they relied more heavily upon her calm presence. Visitors to their home often remarked on her ability to bring peace to tense situations. When a sibling felt neglected or a neighbor's complaint stirred unnecessary conflict, Monica had a way of diffusing the tension simply by listening closely and offering a few soft-spoken words. It was as if she possessed an interior stillness that could not be easily rattled. Even when she felt her own emotions swell within her, she'd already learned the art of waiting a moment, breathing deeply, and choosing the gentler path. This ability would one day become essential in her marriage, but at the time it was simply a natural extension of her upbringing, a habit of heart nurtured by years of quiet reflection. Yet responsibility also brought moments of struggle. Monica was not immune to discouragement. There were days when the weight of expectations felt too heavy, when disputes among family members made her question whether her presence made any difference at all. She felt the sting of misunderstanding, the frustration of seeing efforts unappreciated, the loneliness that sometimes comes when one tries to mediate conflict without receiving gratitude in return. In those moments, she turned inward, seeking again the inner sanctuary she had cultivated since childhood. Prayer became not only a ritual, but a refuge, a place where she could place her burdens quietly before God and ask for the strength to continue. During this period, a deeper awareness began to take root within her, the recognition that her life would not be defined solely by her own choices, but also by those of others whom she would one day be called to accompany. She did not yet know whom she would marry or what her future family would be like, but she sensed that her vocation would involve a kind of steadfastness that required long training of the heart. Perhaps it was for this reason that she felt drawn to acts of charity beyond her home. She visited the sick in her community, especially the elderly who lived alone on the outskirts of Tagaste. She sat beside them, listening to stories of their youth, hearing their fears about the future, offering whatever comfort she could. These visits taught her the value of presence, of simply being with someone whose burdens could not be lifted but could be shared. In these years, she began to observe more keenly the struggles of women around her. Some were burdened by harsh marriages, others by children who caused worry, and still others by the loneliness of widowhood. Monica observed them quietly, absorbing their stories into her heart. She learned how many difficulties remained hidden behind ordinary routines, how often a woman's strength was revealed only through silent endurance. These observations sowed within her a profound empathy and a recognition that life would not spare her from sorrow. Yet instead of shrinking from this truth, she allowed it to deepen her compassion. She began to pray not only for herself, but for all those whose hearts were weighted with unspoken grief. Her relationship with Scripture also matured during this time. She returned again to the stories she had loved as a girl, but now they carried new meaning. She read of Ruth, who followed her mother-in-law with unwavering devotion, and she wondered whether she too would one day be asked to make sacrifices for the sake of those she loved. She listened again to the story of the persistent widow who pleaded before the unjust judge, and she felt a stirring of recognition, though she did not yet know why. These stories awakened within her a quiet resilience, a sense that faith was not something one lived only when life felt easy, but something that took root deepest during trials. There were also moments of youthful joy and simplicity. Monica enjoyed the festivals that marked the seasons in her town, where neighbors gathered to share meals, music drifted through open windows, and children played among the olive groves. Though her temperament was naturally calm, she was capable of laughter, of enjoying the simple pleasures of sunlit afternoons, of appreciating the beauty of her homeland. Such joys did not distract from her sense of responsibility. Rather, they refreshed her spirit and reminded her that God's blessings were woven throughout daily life. As she approached marriageable age, her parents began to consider potential suitors. Monica herself did not seek romance or grandeur. She hoped simply for a stable home where faith might grow. Yet life, as it often does, had different plans. Her future husband, Patricius, came from a respected family but was known for his fiery temperament and lack of religious faith. Monica sensed immediately that the union would demand much from her. Still, she accepted her parents' decision with grace, trusting that God could work within any circumstance, even one that seemed difficult from the beginning. For now, however, she remained in the years just before that marriage, the quiet threshold where responsibility teaches its final lessons before the storm winds of adulthood truly begin. She continued to cultivate patience, to deepen her prayer life, to refine her understanding of compassion. And though she did not yet know it, she was being prepared for the greatest challenge of her life, the role of wife to a man whose temper would test her daily, and later, the role of mother to a son whose brilliant mind would wander far from the faith she cherished. These transitional years passed like gently turning pages, each one adding a layer of strength and tenderness to her spirit. They were years in which she learned to see beyond her own desires, to embrace the needs of others, to recognize that love is not simply a feeling, but a decision made anew each day. And as this chapter of her life draws to a close, we are left to wonder, how would this young woman, shaped by quiet virtues, fare when faced with storms far stronger than anything she had yet imagined? And so, from the calm resolve of Monica's early womanhood, where responsibility had begun shaping her in quiet, deliberate ways, the story moves into a chapter that would alter the entire course of her life. It is here, in the tender space between youthful hope and adult reality, that Monica enters a marriage that would test every virtue she possessed. This was not a union formed through affection or mutual understanding, nor was it the fruit of shared faith. Instead, as was common in her time, her family chose a husband for her based on practical considerations, stability, lineage, and the expectations of society. His name was Patricius. He was respected in their community, a man of standing, skilled in civic matters, and devoted to maintaining order in his home. Yet beneath this respectable surface lived a man whose temper burned quickly, whose impulses shaped his decisions, and whose beliefs stood far from the Christian faith Monica cherished. What she entered was not the gentle haven she might have once dreamed of, but a household marked by unpredictability and emotional storms that would both wound and refine her. From the moment she stepped into her new home, Monica sensed the shifting atmosphere. The air felt heavier, the walls echoed with sharper sounds, and the household's rhythm lacked the peace she had known since childhood. Patricius was not intentionally cruel, yet his temper erupted without warning. Small frustrations could ignite him, causing arguments to spark like dry tinder brushed by flame. Monica, now a young bride learning the nuances of marriage, found herself at the mercy of emotions not her own. Though she responded with the patience she had nurtured over the years, she could not escape the sting of harsh words or the loneliness that comes when two hearts do not share the same foundation of belief. But even here, in the shadow of tension, Monica's quiet strength began to reveal itself in new ways. Instead of allowing bitterness to grow within her, she turned inward, cultivating a deeper well of prayer and reflection. In the evenings when her husband's anger had subsided, she would sit in the corner of their home, whispering her concerns to God, asking for the grace to endure, to understand, and to love even when love demanded sacrifice. Her companions were her thoughts, her faith, and the hope that one day the peace she longed for would find its way into her marriage. Such prayer was not dramatic. It was steady, persistent, and woven into every corner of her life. The challenges extended beyond Patricius himself. His mother, who lived with them, shared his temperament and often brought conflict into the household. Monica, still adjusting to her new role as wife and daughter-in-law, faced criticism and suspicion from a woman who could not understand her gentleness. It would have been easy for Monica to defend herself, to push back, or to retreat in resentment. Yet she chose a different path. With patience that baffled even those who disliked her, she returned harshness with kindness, hostility with service, suspicion with quiet integrity. Over time, her mother-in-law's heart softened, not through argument or persuasion, but through the constancy of a character she could no longer deny. It was one of the first small victories Monica experienced in her married life, a reminder that love, when sustained with perseverance, carries a transformative power no anger can permanently resist. Still, her marriage was not free of moments that pierced deeply. Patricius was often away, caught up in civic matters or friendships that led him into patterns of indulgence. He lacked the moral grounding Monica longed to see in the man who shared her life. She feared for him, not only because of his temper, but because of the spiritual emptiness she sensed beneath his actions. She wished she could speak to him of her faith, of the God who had been her refuge since childhood, of the quiet strength that prayer brought to her heart. Yet she knew such conversations would be met with misunderstanding or dismissal. So instead of trying to change him through words, she prayed for him with the same devotion she gave to all her burdens, trusting that transformation belongs to God alone. As months turned into years, Monica's reputation among the women of her community began to grow. They noticed the way she carried herself, calm, composed, gentle even in the face of provocation. Some approached her seeking advice on their own marital struggles, asking how she found the patience to endure frustration without allowing anger to take root. Monica never spoke of herself as an example. She simply shared what she knew to be true, that love, to be real, must sometimes be sacrificial, and that strength is found not in asserting one's will, but in entrusting one's life to God. Her words were simple, but they struck deeply in the hearts of those who sought guidance. Many women began imitating her behavior, choosing gentleness in their own homes, hoping it would lead to greater harmony. There were those who whispered that Monica was too passive, too willing to accept difficulty without complaint. Yet those whispers never reached the depth of her interior life. She was not passive. She was disciplined. She was not resigned. She was committed. Her faith did not excuse the hardships of her marriage. It transformed them into opportunities for grace. And though she felt the ache of loneliness at times, she carried it with a quiet dignity, believing that God saw her tears, even if the world around her did not. Eventually, the marriage bore small fruits that Monica had not dared to imagine. Patricius, though still distant from the faith, began to admire her character. He noticed how neighbors respected her, how her presence brought peace into the home, how conflicts lessened simply through her steady temperament. He began to restrain his temper more often, not out of principle, but out of respect for her. He still struggled, still wrestled with old habits, but something within him softened, a small sign that Monica's love, though silent, was not without effect. During these years, Monica's longing for children grew stronger. She prayed that if God blessed their marriage with children, she might raise them in the faith that sustained her. This longing was not merely for the joy of motherhood. It was a hope to bring new life into a household that desperately needed the gentleness and wisdom of God's presence. And when she finally conceived, her prayers deepened, for she sensed that her future child would bring both joy and sorrow, both hope and heartache, and that her role as mother would require every lesson her life had taught her. What she did not yet know was that this child, this son named Augustine, would one day test her more than her marriage ever had, drawing her into the painful mystery of watching someone she loved wander far from truth. But for now, these were only the early years of her marriage, years of learning, enduring, loving, praying, and trusting that nothing given to God is ever lost. And as this chapter settles into stillness, one wonders quietly, where does a woman find the strength to persist in love when love demands so much? And so, from the uneasy peace of Monica's early married life, where patience had begun its long work, softening tempers and steadying the household, the story moves gently into a new chapter, one marked not only by trial, but also by one of the deepest joys a woman of her time could know. Into this complicated home, where her husband's mood still shifted like sudden winds, and where she had learned to navigate every conversation with care, Monica brought forth a child, a son whose birth filled her heart with luminous hope. She named him Augustine, a name that felt both strong and tender, a name she whispered in prayer from the moment she first held him, as if offering his life to God long before she understood the magnitude of what that offering would one day require. In those early days of motherhood, Monica felt something new awakening within her, a profound sense of mission, a quiet conviction that this child was entrusted to her with a purpose she could only begin to sense. Augustine's infancy brought a rare harmony to the home, softening even Patricius, who held his son with pride and welcomed the calmer tones that settled around them in those first months. For a time, the tensions of marriage receded, replaced by the gentle rhythms of feeding, rocking, and singing softly to the small child nestled in her arms. Monica treasured these moments with a tenderness that seemed to cast light over the darker corners of her life. She prayed over him as he slept, touching her hand lightly to his forehead and asking God to keep his heart open, his mind clear, and his future anchored in truth. The early signs of his alertness delighted her, for Augustine showed curiosity even as an infant, turning toward voices, studying faces, and responding with expressions that seemed wiser than his tiny years. As Augustine grew from infant to toddler, Monica began to notice something unmistakable. His mind was unusually sharp, his memory keen, his desire to understand the world around him almost insatiable. He asked questions constantly, pointed to things with a determination to know their meaning, and displayed a boldness that made even his father pause. Patricius, though still distant from Monica's faith, took pride in his son's cleverness, often boasting to neighbors about the boy's potential. But for Monica, Augustine's brilliance stirred both joy and a quiet sense of responsibility. She saw in him the possibility for great good and the danger of great wandering. She knew that children with quick minds often ran ahead of guidance, following desires rather than wisdom, and so she began shaping his earliest years with gentle intention, offering him stories from Scripture, blessing him at night, and teaching him simple prayers suited to his age. Even then, she sensed his spirit was like a young tree growing fast, beautiful but vulnerable to strong winds. Her hopes for Augustine were not born from ambition. She did not dream of status or honor for him. She wished only that his gifts might serve God. And yet, as he grew, she saw hints of traits that caused her quiet concern. He was quick to anger when frustrated, quick to grasp at pleasures, quick to seek attention. These were normal impulses for a child, but in Augustine, they appeared with a particular intensity. Monica observed him carefully, correcting him with firmness, but also with love, praying that discipline would shape his character before habits hardened. She believed deeply that early seeds determine later fruit, and she did everything in her power to plant seeds of faith, humility, and compassion. Still, motherhood brought its challenges. The household remained imperfect. Patricius's temper flared at times, and Augustine, with his sensitive nature, began learning emotions from both parents, the calm of his mother and the sudden heat of his father. Monica worried about what impressions might take root. When arguments arose, she often tried to shield her son, distracting him with gentle stories or taking him into the courtyard to let him watch the shifting patterns of sunlight through the leaves. She longed to give him a stable foundation, something firm enough to withstand the unpredictable tempers that sometimes shook their home. And though she could not shield him from every difficulty, she tried to ensure that love always had the final word in his experience. As her son continued to grow, Monica's spiritual life deepened alongside her motherhood. She fasted regularly, prayed not only for her husband but now with greater fervor for Augustine, and offered small sacrifices in private, skipping luxuries, rising earlier to pray, choosing silence instead of defending herself during tense moments. Each sacrifice was an offering for the future of her child. She knew that God alone could guard a soul, yet she also believed that a mother's love, when offered through prayer, carried a mysterious power that could soften even the hardest hearts. These years taught her that the vocation of motherhood is not simply to nurture a child's body, but to accompany a soul, gently guiding it toward truth even before words can explain what truth means. When Augustine reached school age, his natural intelligence became even more evident. He excelled quickly, surpassing children older than himself, absorbing lessons with a nimbleness that astonished his teachers. They praised his sharp mind, his gift for language, his ability to grasp complex ideas. Monica felt immense pride but also a quiet trembling within her, for she knew that brilliance can be a double-edged sword. A clever mind can open doors to wisdom or lead someone further into the illusions of pride. And as Augustine began forming friendships and seeking approval from his peers, she sensed the beginning of a tension that would only grow with time, the bright pull of worldly admiration against the quieter call of faith. Her prayers intensified in these years. She prayed that Christian baptism, delayed at the time for cultural reasons, would one day anchor Augustine's heart. She prayed that he would find good influences among his peers, that his teachers would guide him well, that he would not lose himself to the excitement of learning for its own glory. She prayed that God would place his hand upon her son's life with a firmness stronger than anything the world could offer. These prayers became the steady breath of her days, woven into her chores, her conversations, even the moments when she watched her son sleep with a peace she longed to protect. Yet for all her efforts, Monica began to see small incidents that troubled her. Moments of disobedience, flashes of defiance, choices made out of impulse rather than conscience. Augustine stole small objects, argued fiercely when corrected, and became prone to mischief with other boys, testing boundaries as bright children often do. These were not grave sins, but they revealed a restless nature that would one day drive him far from the path she hoped he would follow. Still, she refused to lose heart. She held on to her trust that God guides each soul in his own time, even when the journey winds through shadows. As this chapter of her story closes, the dawning of motherhood, the early joys and sorrows, the first glimpses of Augustine's remarkable gifts and troubling impulses, we are left with the sense that Monica's life had entered a new and more demanding vocation. She was no longer simply a wife navigating the storms of marriage. She was now a mother entrusted with a child whose destiny would one day shape history. And as we move forward, one cannot help but wonder, how does a mother prepare her heart for a future she cannot yet see, especially when that future will test every fiber of her faith? And so, from the tender beginnings of Augustine's childhood, where a mother's hopes flickered gently beside the small flame of a boy's awakening mind, the story moves into a season marked by growth, tension, and the first hints of a destiny neither Monica nor her son yet understood. These were the years when Augustine's intellect stretched like a young vine toward every source of light it could find, reaching eagerly, boldly, sometimes recklessly. With each passing month, his talents became more evident, not only to Monica and Patricius, but to neighbors, teachers, and friends who marveled at the speed with which he absorbed new knowledge. Yet brilliance, when left unguided, can wander into dangerous places. And in Augustine, this restless intelligence grew alongside a temperament quick to seek pleasure, attention, and admiration. Traits that delighted some and worried others, especially the one who watched most closely, his mother. By the time he reached adolescence, Augustine had already become a boy of two worlds. In one world, he was the attentive student who excelled in grammar and rhetoric, who could recite lines of poetry with a maturity beyond his years, who learned to shape words with a precision that made teachers predict he would one day stand among the finest minds of his generation. In the other world, however, he was a spirited youth who felt the pull of excitement, novelty, and the companionship of peers who found delight in bending rules. The tension between these two worlds grew stronger with each year, as if Augustine stood always at a crossroads, unsure which path truly called to him. Monica watched this, unfolding with both wonder and unease. She rejoiced at his intellectual gifts, for she knew God grants such talents with purpose, but she also sensed how easily pride could take root in a young heart hungry for recognition. She noticed how Augustine reacted to praise, how his eyes brightened, how he sought opportunities to impress others, how he grew impatient with those slower than himself. She saw how he began to delight not only in learning, but in the admiration it brought him. And though she corrected him gently, reminding him that wisdom must be rooted in humility, her words often slid past him like pebbles rolling from a polished stone. Augustine listened, but he did not yet understand. His father, proud of his son's promise, encouraged the ambitions of brilliance without recognizing its dangers. Patricius boasted publicly about Augustine's intellect, telling neighbors that his son would one day bring honor to the family. He took great pride in Augustine's quick wit, his sharp memory, his capacity for debate. But he did not see how the boy's soul was forming beneath the surface. He did not notice how easily Augustine was swayed by peers who admired boldness more than virtue, or how deeply the boy craved to belong, to be noticed, to be celebrated. Patricius saw potential for status. Monica saw the shadow of temptation. In these years, Augustine formed friendships that both enriched and endangered him. Some companions inspired him to think deeply, to question, to explore the world of ideas. Others pulled him into mischief, daring him to test boundaries and seek secret thrills. There were moments when his cleverness became a shield behind which he hid misbehavior. Monica learned of small incidents, stolen fruit, pranks played on neighbors, lies told to escape punishment. And though such actions might have been dismissed as ordinary youthful mischief, she perceived something deeper. She saw a soul drawn toward what was forbidden, not out of necessity, but out of the strange thrill of simply desiring it. This troubled her, for she knew that desire, if not disciplined, can one day become chains. One incident in particular carved itself into her awareness, a moment Augustine would later recount with sorrow in his own writings. He and a group of friends crept into a neighbor's orchard to steal pears, not because they were hungry, nor because the fruit was rare, but simply for the sake of doing something forbidden. They carried the pears away, took a few bites, and threw the rest to pigs, laughing as they did so. When Monica learned of the theft, she felt a deep ache, not because of the pears themselves, but because the delight he took in doing wrong revealed a danger she had long feared. She prayed that God would turn these early impulses toward goodness before they hardened into habits that would be difficult to uproot. Yet even as Augustine's mischief grew, so too did his capacity for contemplation. He was not a boy without conscience. At times he would sit quietly after being corrected, staring at the floor, wrestling inwardly with emotions he could not yet articulate. Monica sometimes caught him lingering at the edge of family prayer, as if drawn toward the peace it offered, yet unwilling to step fully into it. These moments gave her hope. They revealed a heart that, though easily led astray, was also capable of deep reflection, and this gave her the courage to continue praying, guiding, dreaming of the man he might become. School intensified Augustine's inner divisions. He excelled, yet he also grew more aware of the expectations placed upon him. Success became both a comfort and a pressure. He longed to please his teachers, to surpass his peers, to prove himself worthy of the opportunities his father envisioned for him. But at the same time, he grew resentful of harsh discipline, especially the beatings that were common in schools of the Roman world. Augustine's pride resisted correction, and his sensitive nature made him particularly wounded by public scolding. He felt torn between admiration for knowledge and anger toward authority. These emotions simmered within him, forming a complex interior life that Monica sensed but could not fully read. At home, her role grew more challenging. Augustine was no longer the small child who came willingly to her side for comfort. He was becoming a young man, forming his own views, asserting his independence. Their conversations grew shorter, his questions more distant, his attention more divided. Yet Monica refused to withdraw. She approached him not with pressure, but with gentleness, offering guidance when he asked for it, but more often offering simply her presence, steady, warm, patient. She continued to pray over him each night, trusting that God alone could work in the spaces where her words could no longer reach. As the years of adolescence unfolded, the contrast within Augustine sharpened further. He became increasingly drawn to performances and public speaking, where he could showcase his rhetorical gifts. Crowds, however small, fascinated him. Applause nourished him. He dreamed of becoming a great orator, imagining a future where all eyes turned toward him as he spoke. But he also grew restless, dissatisfied with the limitations of his small town, yearning for the wider world beyond Tagaste. Rome, Carthage, and the great centers of learning began to fill his imagination with promises of freedom, excitement, and glory. Monica recognized this restlessness as both a sign of his potential and a warning. She feared the cities for all the temptations they held, yet she knew that sheltering him would not serve him. She could guide him, but she could not confine him. She could pray, but she could not determine his choices. And as she watched him step more confidently into the world of youth, full of brilliance, desire, pride, and longing, she felt her heart tighten with a mother's intuition. The road ahead would not be easy. As this chapter closes, the boy Augustine stands poised on the threshold of young adulthood, his mind bright as flame, his desires stirring like wind before a storm. And Monica, sensing the gathering clouds, prays with greater urgency, wondering quietly, how does a mother hold fast to hope when the world begins to pull her child in directions she cannot follow? And so, from the restless beginnings of Augustine's youth, where early brilliance mingled with impulses that unsettled his mother, the story enters a darker, more intricate stretch of his adolescence, a time when innocence began to fade and restless desire took on sharper edges. It is here that we witness the widening divide between a mother's hopes and a son's choices, a divide that would eventually become an ocean. For Augustine was no longer simply a clever boy exploring the world with curiosity. He was becoming a young man thrilled by the taste of independence, emboldened by companions who encouraged mischief, and drawn toward the shadows, not because he misunderstood them, but because something in him delighted in crossing forbidden thresholds. These years, though ordinary on the surface, would echo through his life as early signs of a deeper moral struggle, signs Monica perceived with a mother's painful clarity. Adolescence brought Augustine a new intensity of emotion that he struggled to navigate. His pride, which had once appeared as the natural eagerness of a gifted child, evolved into a more potent force. He grew sensitive to praise and wounded by criticism, and he sought validation from peers who valued daring more than virtue. He felt the first stirrings of adult passions, desire, ambition, excitement, and he welcomed them without caution, as though convinced that his sharp mind could protect him from the consequences. Monica noticed these changes not through dramatic events, but through subtle shifts. The way Augustine avoided her gaze when she gently questioned his activities, the way he laughed too loudly with friends who lacked discipline, the way he became impatient with the quiet routines of home. She felt a growing distance, not simply of age but of heart. Among these early signs, the theft of the pears became emblematic of something far deeper. Augustine himself would later recount it as a symbolic moment, not because the act was grave in itself, but because of what it revealed about the darkness coiling quietly within him. On a warm evening, he and several friends slipped into a neighbor's orchard, not for hunger nor necessity, nor even because the pears were particularly good, but out of a strange pleasure in wrongdoing. They plucked the fruit, laughed as they snatched more than they needed, and then tossed them away, savoring not the sweetness of the pears, but the thrill of transgression. The theft was pointless. It was joy rooted in nothingness, a desire to test boundaries simply because they existed. When word reached Monica, she felt a quiet sorrow pierce her heart. She did not scold him harshly. She simply carried the memory into her prayer, whispering to God the fear he could not yet name himself, that her son might learn to love sin for its own sake. But Augustine's missteps were not limited to small thefts. As he matured, he became increasingly drawn to the excitement of experiences forbidden or frowned upon in his Christian upbringing. He began seeking out the company of older youths who enjoyed nights of drinking, feasting, and crude jokes. He learned quickly how to charm those around him, how to appear bold, witty, and clever, earning admiration that fed his swelling pride. These gatherings offered him a sense of belonging, a taste of independence, and a thrill he found intoxicating. But they also hardened him against the quieter voice of conscience that Monica had tried to cultivate in his early years. In these same years, Augustine's moral life suffered from the stirrings of youthful passion. He confessed much later that he struggled intensely with desires he could not control, desires that frightened him, yet enticed him with equal power. He spoke of a boiling of youth that overwhelmed him, pulling him toward choices that left his soul unsettled. Monica sensed these changes, though he never spoke of them directly. She saw it in his eyes, in his behavior, in the restless way he moved through the house. She felt it in the way he avoided extended conversation, choosing instead the company of peers who encouraged rather than restrained his impulses. She feared that Augustine's heart was slipping beyond her reach, pulled toward pleasures that dulled his sense of virtue. Despite her attempts to guide him gently, she found herself increasingly powerless. Advice that once shaped him now seemed to bounce off an unseen shield. Augustine had begun forming an identity apart from his family, drawn more to the praise of his companions than the counsel of his mother. When she warned him about the dangers of pride or the seduction of pleasure, he responded with polite indifference or quiet frustration. He was beginning to resent the boundaries she wished to place around him, boundaries he perceived as limitations rather than protection. School offered little refuge for his soul, even as it sharpened his intellect. Augustine excelled in every academic endeavor. He devoured literature, mastered rhetoric, and grew fascinated by philosophical ideas. His teachers admired him, but they also encouraged competition, ambition, and a hunger for recognition, fuel for a mind already prone to pride. The harsh punishments common in schools of that era only deepened his resentment toward authority. He learned to play the system, to charm teachers, to impress classmates, to win debates through cleverness rather than sincerity. Knowledge became a path not toward wisdom, but toward self-display. And though Monica admired his brilliance, she worried that his intellectual gifts were growing without moral roots. During this time, Augustine began to test the limits of his family's authority more boldly. He stayed out late, returned home smelling of wine, and surrounded himself with friends whose influence she distrusted. She could not forbid him from these pursuits. He was old enough to resist, young enough to evade, but she could pray. And so she did. Often at night, while Augustine slept after evenings of mischief, Monica remained awake, whispering prayers for his soul. She asked God to guard him, to keep him from being swallowed by darkness, to make him restless in his wrongdoing, so that he might one day seek light. Her tears were frequent in these years, tears shed quietly, without bitterness, offered as a kind of sacrifice for the future she hoped he would one day embrace. Yet even amid this growing turmoil, Augustine's brilliance remained undeniable. There were moments when he surprised her with sudden insight, with a question that revealed uncommon depth, with a quiet reflection spoken almost accidentally. These glimpses reassured her that the divine spark within him was not extinguished, only hidden beneath layers of pride and desire. She clung to these moments, storing them in her heart like small lights in a darkening room, believing that grace could kindle even the faintest spark into flame. As this chapter of Augustine's youth draws to a close, we see a young man standing at the edge of a future he cannot yet see, pulled between the brilliance of his mind and the shadows of his desires. And we see Monica, watching him with a mother's aching tenderness, praying that God might intervene before the path he walked carried him too far from home. The distance between them was widening, yet she refused to give up hope. And as we move forward, the question lingers gently in the air. How far can a heart wander before grace begins the long journey of calling it back? And so, from the restless swirl of Augustine's adolescence, those turbulent years in which his mother watched pride and desire begin to overshadow innocence, the story enters a painful new chapter, one shaped by distance, longing, and the quiet ache of separation. Youth had awakened within Augustine a thirst for greatness, for admiration, for experiences that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Tagaste. His mind, quick and eager, had outgrown the lessons of his small town, and the streets he once wandered as a child now felt far too narrow for the ambition stirring within him. He dreamed of cities where rhetoric echoed through grand halls, where scholars debated under marble columns, where ideas flowed as freely as water, and gradually these dreams took the shape of a destination that seemed almost inevitable: Carthage. Carthage was the cultural heart of North Africa, a city alive with intellectual energy, theatrical performances, luxurious pursuits, and philosophies that dazzled restless young minds. For Augustine, it represented a world where he could test the full reach of his brilliance. For Monica, it represented something very different, a place where temptation would grow teeth, where the shadows that had already begun to settle in her son's heart could thicken into a darkness harder to dispel. She sensed this long before Augustine himself understood the full meaning of his desires. She felt it in the quiet dread that formed each time he spoke of Carthage, in the way her heart tightened whenever he mentioned the great cities beyond Tagaste. She knew that the world he sought would not nurture his soul, but she also knew she could not keep him from it. The decision for Augustine to leave came slowly, then all at once, as such decisions often do. Patricius, proud of his son's promise, insisted that Augustine deserved an education befitting his talents. He envisioned a future where Augustine would become a renowned orator, perhaps even a public official whose eloquence would bring honor to the family. Monica, though fearful, did not oppose the plan. She believed deeply in education, and she wished for Augustine's gifts to flourish. But she felt a tremor of sorrow whenever she imagined him walking streets she could not walk beside him, wandering among influences she could not counter, forming friendships she could not soften with her guidance. The preparations for his departure unfolded with a mixture of excitement and grief. Augustine, now filled with anticipation, became more distant from home, as though his heart had already begun to travel before his body followed. He spent hours discussing plans with friends, imagining the life that awaited him. He spoke to his mother with a mixture of affection and impatience, tired of warnings he felt he no longer needed. Monica, however, responded not with fear, but with gentleness. She offered him advice in the quiet way she had learned through years of living with a difficult husband, steady, patient, never forceful. She reminded him to guard his soul, to seek companions who lifted him rather than tempted him, to remember the faith of his family even when surrounded by voices that contradicted it. Augustine listened, but her words passed through him like wind through an open window, felt but not retained. On the morning he prepared to leave, Monica stood quietly by the doorway of their home, watching him gather his belongings. She studied his face, searching for the small child she once rocked to sleep, the boy who once asked endless questions about the stars, the youth who once lingered at the edge of her prayers. But in his place she saw a young man eager for freedom, eager to test himself, eager to break away from the constraints of home. Her heart ached, but she did not cling to him. She knew that love sometimes requires opening one's hands rather than tightening one's grip. Yet the actual moment of departure was far more painful than she expected. When Augustine stepped outside and began walking toward the road that led to Carthage, a wave of sorrow broke within her. She followed him, calling softly, begging him not to abandon the faith she had tried so carefully to plant in his heart. She pleaded that he remain mindful, that he resist the seductions of the city, that he remember her prayers when he felt lost. Augustine, moved but determined, reassured her with kind words, though his mind was already fixed on the world ahead. He embraced her, then continued walking, unaware that this separation would become one of the deepest wounds in her life. For Monica, the days that followed were filled with silent tears. She moved through her household duties with a heart heavy as stone. The absence of her son created a palpable emptiness, an empty place at the table, a silence where his voice once echoed, a lingering ache whenever she walked past his room. She prayed more fervently than ever before. Her prayers grew longer, deeper, more raw. She prayed at dawn, prayed while grinding grain, prayed while waiting for water to boil, prayed again before sleep. Her words were not elaborate. They were simple, repeated pleas. Guard him. Bring him home. Do not let him be lost. But Monica's grief was not only for the distance of miles, it was for the distance of soul. She knew Carthage's reputation well, its theaters filled with seductive performances, its gatherings of philosophers who mocked faith, its students who boasted of their exploits until dawn, its luxurious distractions that swallowed time and conscience with equal hunger. She did not fear the city itself. She feared the subtle seduction of everything Augustine desired, everything that his restless heart yearned for. She sensed with an almost prophetic intuition that Carthage would not merely shape her son's future. It would test him in ways that would pierce her more deeply than anything she had yet endured. During this period, Monica began experiencing something she had not known before, visions. One in particular struck her deeply. In a dream, she found herself standing on a narrow wooden beam, worn smooth by years of weather. Augustine stood beside her, though in the dream she had not expected him to be there. A radiant figure appeared, gentle but commanding, and spoke to her with simple clarity. Where you stand, he stands also. She awoke with the sense that God himself had offered her reassurance, that her son, though wandering, would one day return to the path she prayed for him. When she recounted this dream to Augustine later, he dismissed it casually, claiming it meant she would adopt his beliefs. But Monica, with her characteristic quiet certainty, responded simply, "No, my son. It was not said that I stand where you are. It was said that you stand where I am." This dream became her anchor. It steadied her heart during long nights of worry, strengthened her when news from Carthage grew troubling, and reminded her that a mother's tears are never shed unseen. It was only the first of many consolations that would come to her in the years of wandering ahead. For now, though, the story settles gently on this moment of separation. Augustine walking boldly toward a future shaped by pride and desire, and Monica standing behind, her prayers rising like incense from the quiet corners of her home. And as this chapter closes, one cannot help but wonder, how many tears can a mother shed before heaven begins to stir in response? And so, from the moment Augustine disappeared down the road to Carthage, leaving behind the tender ache of a mother's outstretched hands, the story enters one of its most painful and defining landscapes, the long years in which Monica's son surrendered himself to the seductions of a glittering world, while she, far away, kept vigil in the silence of night. These were years marked by a profound contrast, a deep spiritual tension stretching across the distance between them. In Carthage, Augustine pursued pleasure, ambition, and intellectual conquest with fierce enthusiasm. In Tagaste, Monica pursued him with tears, steadfast prayer, and an unshakable conviction that God was tracing a path through even his darkest wanderings. Their lives, though bound by love, now unfolded in two separate realms, one vibrant and reckless, the other quiet and wounded, yet anchored in hope. Carthage was everything Augustine had dreamed, and more. The city pulsed with excitement, a crossroads of cultures, languages, and ideas. Its markets overflowed with goods from distant lands. Its forums echoed with heated debates. Its theaters dazzled audiences with performances that ignited emotions. For a young man hungry for stimulation, for admiration, for the thrill of new experiences, Carthage was intoxicating. Augustine arrived eager to learn, and he applied himself with astonishing dedication to the study of rhetoric. His natural gifts flourished in this environment. Teachers praised him, students admired him, and soon he found himself rising among the ranks of those considered most promising. The academic world opened to him like a vast treasury, and he rushed in with open hands, delighted by every discovery. But Carthage was not simply a place of learning. It was a city that offered passions without restraint. Its nights were alive with feasts, music, wine, and revelry. Philosophers gathered in candlelit rooms to debate ideas that denied the teachings of Christianity. Young men boasted about their exploits with women and their daring acts of defiance. Groups of rowdy students known for their destructive pranks roamed the streets, causing chaos for sport. It was a place where the mind could soar, while the soul slowly unraveled. Augustine, brilliant and eager to belong, plunged into this world without hesitation. The loneliness he felt upon arriving quickly faded as he found companions who shared his interests, his hunger for excitement, and his disregard for moral boundaries. He was drawn easily into their circle, swept along by the exhilaration of feeling admired, included, celebrated. He attended theatrical performances that stirred dangerous emotions, submitting himself willingly to the sway of passions he barely understood. He drank, he feasted, he sought the warmth of illicit relationships. His desires, once merely the stirrings of youth, now grew into fierce temptations that dominated many of his choices. In time, Augustine formed a relationship with a young woman whose name history does not record. Their bond deepened into something tender, though far outside the boundaries of Christian teaching. She became his companion for many years, and though their love was sincere in its own way, it was rooted in passion rather than commitment. They shared a life together, and in time their union bore a son. Augustine loved the child dearly, but this new life also tied him more tightly to a world of choices that drew him further from his mother's hopes. Yet even amid the indulgence, Augustine was not at peace. A deep restlessness gnawed at him, a sense of dissatisfaction that lingered beneath the pleasures he pursued. His mind, brilliant as it was, could not silence the quiet unease within him. It was this inner turmoil that eventually led him toward a new philosophy, Manichaeism. a seductive belief system that promised enlightenment without sacrifice, spiritual knowledge without moral transformation. Its teachers spoke in grand terms about light and darkness, claiming to explain the mysteries of the universe with a clarity that captivated Augustine's intellect. He embraced their teachings eagerly, believing he had found a truth superior to the faith of his childhood. He rejected Christianity with growing pride, repeating the arguments of his new mentors and dismissing the scriptures as too simple for a mind such as his. News of Augustine's philosophical shift reached Monica slowly, like a shadow creeping across the floor of her home. When she first learned that her son had joined the Manichaeans, her heart tightened with a fear that left her breathless. She had worried about the temptations of the city. She had dreaded the influence of its pleasures. But she had not anticipated a spiritual seduction so profound. This was not merely misbehavior or youthful impulsiveness. This was her son placing his trust in false teachers, rejecting the faith she had raised him in, and giving his brilliant mind to a system that denied God's truth. The weight of this knowledge felt almost unbearable, yet Monica did not surrender to despair. She wept. Yes, she wept with a depth of sorrow only a mother can understand, but her tears became prayers, and her grief became fuel for a new intensity of intercession. She prayed not only for her son's behavior now, but for his soul in eternity. She prayed for Augustine with a fierceness that startled even those who knew her well. Her nights grew longer, her fasts more frequent. She turned her entire life into an offering for his return, believing with unwavering certainty that God heard every whispered plea. Her prayers were not abstract, they were precise. She asked God to place mentors in Augustine's life who would lead him toward truth. She asked for obstacles to be placed in the path of his wrongdoing. She asked for moments of awakening, even of sorrow, if they were needed to bring him back. Her clarity of purpose became the refuge she clung to when grief threatened to overwhelm her. There were times when Monica felt utterly alone in her anguish, yet she continued her vigil. Late at night, when the household slept, she sat in the small courtyard outside her home, eyes lifted toward a sky thick with stars, whispering Augustine's name to the one who never sleeps. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that God would one day answer her prayers, not because she deserved it, but because God's mercy was vast, and because a mother's love, when united with faith, becomes a force capable of moving heaven itself. In Carthage, meanwhile, Augustine felt none of her prayers directly, yet they moved silently around him. He felt moments of sudden dissatisfaction with the teachings he once admired. He experienced unexpected stirrings of conscience he could not explain. He felt flashes of longing for something deeper, though he did not yet connect these moments to the tears being shed far away on his behalf. And so, as this chapter of the story settles into its final notes, we find Augustine rising in the world of Carthage, sought after for his brilliance, admired for his eloquence, yet increasingly entangled in choices that distance him from truth. And we find Monica, steadfast in Tagaste, holding vigil through sleepless nights, her heart aching but never abandoning hope. For even as her son walked deeper into the shadows, she believed with a conviction beyond reason that light would one day break through. And as we turn to the next chapter, we are left with a question whispered softly in the silence between them. How long must a heart wander before it feels the pull of home? And so, from the long ache of watching Augustine lose himself amid the passions and philosophies of Carthage, the story now moves into one of its most heartbreaking turns, a chapter shaped not only by distance of belief, but by a sudden deliberate separation of body and home. For there comes a moment in nearly every wandering life when the desire for freedom becomes so overpowering that even the softest bonds of love seem like obstacles to escape. That moment arrived for Augustine the year he resolved to leave Africa altogether to pursue opportunity in Rome, and to do so without telling the mother whose tears had followed him through every shadow. It was a decision born of ambition, frustration, and the restless hunger that had always driven him. Yet for Monica, this decision would carve one of the deepest wounds she had ever known. Augustine's years in Carthage had been both triumphant and troubling. His talent for rhetoric had drawn the admiration of teachers and fellow students alike. He secured opportunities to teach, gaining a small but growing reputation as one whose eloquence could sway crowds and ignite debate. Yet even as his reputation blossomed, a dissatisfaction began to take hold within him. He grew frustrated with Carthaginian students who were notorious for their unruly behavior, their pranks, their disruptive antics. They disrespected their teachers, barged into lectures, and often refused to pay their fees. Augustine, who craved order and intellectual seriousness, felt suffocated by their immaturity. He longed for a place where the pursuit of learning would be treated with dignity, where his talent could flourish without the constant irritation of undisciplined pupils. Rumors reached him of the academic life in Rome. There, students were said to be respectful, ambitious, and attentive. The city itself was the heart of the empire, the center of culture, law, and intellectual refinement. For a man like Augustine, gifted, ambitious, restless, the promise of Rome seemed irresistible. It offered a stage worthy of his talents, a world that matched the scale of his dreams. And as the idea took hold in his mind, it grew into a resolve that he could no longer ignore. Yet he knew one thing with painful clarity. If he told his mother of his plans, she would beg him not to go. She would plead with him, weep for him, warn him of dangers far greater than those he had already faced. She would try to convince him that God had not finished speaking to him in Africa. And because Augustine was not yet strong enough to resist the sorrow in her voice, he chose what many young hearts choose when fear mixes with hope. He chose avoidance. He began to prepare his departure in secret. He spoke little of his growing dissatisfaction with Carthage. He hid the details of arrangements made with a group of travelers heading toward the port. He carried on with daily life as though nothing were changing. And all the while, Monica continued praying for him, unaware that her son was quietly packing his hopes into a future that did not include her presence. But mothers often sense what is left unspoken. In the days leading up to his departure, Monica felt a subtle shift in Augustine's manner, a kind of guardedness, as though a part of him were already slipping away. She questioned him gently, but he offered vague reassurances. Still, intuition stirred within her. She lingered near him more often, prayed with even greater urgency, and kept her heart wide open to any sign of what he might be planning. It was not until the final night before Augustine planned to board a ship that Monica discovered the truth. Something in her heart caused her to go to the harbor, perhaps to seek him, perhaps simply to pray. There she found him, not in open conversation, not preparing for a future they could discuss, but moving in secret among the travelers who would accompany him to Rome. Realizing the gravity of what was happening, Monica ran to him, her heart pounding with grief. She clung to him, begged him not to leave Africa, pleaded with him to reconsider. She reminded him of the dangers of life among strangers, of the temptations that awaited him, of the faith that he continued to abandon. Augustine, torn between ambition and affection, felt conflicted, but not enough to stay. When she saw that her words were not softening him, Monica did something desperate. She refused to leave him. She insisted she would accompany him to the ship, that she would remain at his side until he agreed to return home. Augustine, exhausted by her persistence, gently urged her to rest in a small chapel nearby, grandly named the Church of St. Cyprian, reassuring her that she could pray while he made final preparations. The chapel was quiet and cool, its stone floor worn by the knees of supplicants who had prayed there for years. Monica entered reluctantly, trusting that this sacred place might soften her son's resolve. But Augustine had no intention of waiting for her. The moment she stepped inside and lowered her head in prayer, he slipped away to the harbor, boarded the ship, and set sail. When Monica emerged and saw the empty shoreline, saw the distant vessel moving slowly away across the water, her grief erupted in waves so deep she could barely stand. She cried out, begging God for strength, her voice lost in the sound of the sea. She had been left not only by a son, but by the illusion that she could protect him through proximity. The ship carried Augustine westward as Monica stood alone, her tears falling onto the earth like small drops of an offering that would one day bear fruit. Yet even in her devastated sorrow, she did not curse him, she did not resent him, she did not abandon hope. She wept, but her weeping was prayer. She suffered, but her suffering became intercession. And though she felt utterly helpless in that moment, she trusted that God could go where she could not, reach her son's heart in ways she could not, and shape his destiny through means she did not yet understand. Back on the ship, Augustine felt a mixture of relief and guilt. He believed he needed Rome to reach the greatness he sought, yet part of him knew the price he had paid by deceiving his mother. He pushed the thought away, convincing himself that someday she would understand. But the truth lingered beneath his confidence. He had broken her heart. And though he did not yet know it, the ache of that wound would echo within him for years, returning to him in moments of crisis, shaping the very path that would eventually lead him home. As this chapter closes, we find mother and son separated not only by distance, but by decisions that cut deeply into the bond they shared. Augustine sails toward a future of ambition and error. Monica stands rooted in a faith that will not abandon him. And as the waves carry him away, a quiet question rises in her heart like a whispered prayer. Can love reach across an ocean, and can grace find someone determined to run from it? And so, from the bitter pain of watching the ship carry Augustine away, his figure shrinking into the horizon while her tears mingled with the salt of the sea, the story moves into a chapter shaped by mysteries that lie beyond human control. For even as Augustine fled from his mother's embrace, from her guidance, from her faith, heaven was quietly arranging a series of encounters and consolations that would become the hidden architecture of his conversion. In these years, Monica's grief was pierced by moments of unexpected light, visions, prophetic words, and interior certainties so gentle yet powerful that they sustained her through trials she could not yet foresee. If the earlier stages of her life were shaped by patience and endurance, this chapter was shaped by something deeper still, a trust so rooted in God that even sorrow became a doorway to grace. After Augustine's departure, Monica returned to Tagaste in a state of profound mourning. Her steps felt heavy, her home unbearably silent, her prayers burdened by the knowledge that her son had not only left her physically, but had also drifted further still from the faith she cherished. She grieved the deception as deeply as the departure. For though Augustine had lied to spare himself her tears, the wound it left behind cut to the core of her heart. Still, Monica's sorrow was not the sorrow that collapses into despair. It was the sorrow that kneels, the sorrow that whispers rather than curses, the sorrow that transforms pain into prayer. She spent long hours in her small prayer corner, her hands clasped tightly, her face bowed low, offering God the same plea again and again, "Bring him back, not merely to me, but to you." Yet as deeply as she suffered, God did not leave her without comfort. One night, soon after Augustine's departure, Monica experienced a dream so vivid and consoling that it became one of the great turning points of her life. In the dream, she stood upon a narrow wooden beam, unsturdy, worn, hardly enough to support her weight. Her heart felt heavy, her spirit weary. Then a radiant figure appeared before her, one whose presence stirred both awe and peace. The figure spoke words simple and profound, words that Monica could never forget. "Where you stand, he stands also." She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, yet a peace spread through her like warm light. She understood its meaning instantly. Her son would one day stand upon the beam of faith with her. Though he had wandered far, though he had embraced false beliefs, though he had deceived her, still God had promised she and Augustine would one day be united in truth. She clung to that dream like a lifeline. Whenever sorrow pressed upon her, she remembered the radiant figure, the promise inscribed upon her heart, and the certainty that God's mercy was already pursuing her son. When Augustine learned of the dream, his mind, shaped by pride and the sharp logic of rhetoric, twisted its meaning. He laughed and suggested it meant she would eventually embrace his beliefs. But Monica, grounded in a deeper wisdom, replied with serene clarity, "No, my son, it was not said that I stand where you are, but that you stand where I am." In that simple correction lay all her hope. Soon after, God offered her another consolation, this time through the words of a bishop known for both wisdom and compassion. Seeing her grief and hearing her fears for her son, he listened patiently as she poured out her pain. Her tears for Augustine's immoral living, her sorrow over his Manichaean beliefs, her fear for his soul. The bishop, moved by her steadfast devotion, did not offer false assurances. Instead, he spoke a truth that would echo through centuries. It is not possible that the son of so many tears should perish. These words struck her heart with the force of a divine message. They were not merely comforting, they were prophetic. She carried them like a seal upon her soul, repeating them whenever despair threatened to swallow her. They became for her a promise that God Himself had taken notice of her tears. Meanwhile, in Rome, Augustine encountered the reality of his choices in ways he had not expected. He found opportunities, yes, students who admired him, teachers who respected his brilliance, and circles of intellectuals who mirrored his philosophical interests. But he also discovered the darker side of ambition. Students in Rome were indeed more disciplined than those in Carthage, yet they carried a different fault. They often fled without paying their teachers. Augustine, who had left Africa seeking respect and stability, found himself repeatedly cheated by those who praised his lectures, yet disappeared before the time came to pay their fees. These disappointments stirred a growing disillusionment in him. Rome, he realized, was not the paradise of opportunity he had envisioned. It was a place where even the brightest minds could be exploited, where cleverness did not guarantee integrity, where praise hid self-interest more than truth. He also fell ill soon after his arrival, a sickness so severe that he believed he might die. Lying in bed, feverish and alone, he felt a fear he had not known before, a fear of the unknown, of judgment, of the emptiness that stretched before him. In those moments he remembered his mother's faith. He remembered her prayers, her teachings, her tears. Something within him softened, though he resisted it fiercely. Had Monica known of his sickness, she would have flown to him instantly. But God, in His mysterious timing, allowed her absence to become part of her son's silent awakening. When Augustine recovered, he sought new opportunities and soon learned of a prestigious teaching post in Milan. Ambitious as ever, he seized the chance, hoping Milan's academic sphere would offer what Rome had not. Yet unbeknownst to him, Milan held far more than professional opportunity. It held the presence of a man whose wisdom and holiness would one day reshape his life. Bishop Ambrose. While Augustine moved from city to city, philosophy to philosophy, pleasure to pleasure, Monica remained steadfast in her vigil. Her life took on a rhythm shaped entirely by intercession. She prayed at dawn for Augustine's mind. She prayed at noon for his friendships. She prayed at sunset for his protection. She prayed at night for his salvation. Her tears were not desperate. They were deliberate, offered as though she were watering the unseen roots of a future she trusted but could not yet perceive. But her prayers did not remain confined to Tagaste. As soon as she learned Augustine had traveled to Rome and then to Milan, she followed him, driven not by control, but by love. Her decision was not reckless. It was courageous. She believed with the certainty of faith that she was meant to accompany her son, spiritually if not physically, wherever his wandering took him. If God had given her the mission of praying him into salvation, then she would pursue that mission across continents. No ocean, no storm, no disappointment could break her resolve. And so, as this chapter closes, we witness a mother fortified by divine consolation, her heart anchored by dreams and prophetic words, her steps guided not by fear, but by unwavering trust. Augustine may have fled her presence, but he could not outrun her love. And even now, though he does not yet know it, the invisible cords of grace are beginning to tighten around him. In the quiet between this chapter and the next, one wonders gently, how far can a soul wander before it encounters the very mercy it has tried so desperately to escape? And so, from the consolations that steadied Monica's heart, the dream that promised unity, the bishop's words that assured her of God's faithfulness, the story moves into a new landscape, where her son, wandering farther than ever, begins unknowingly to encounter the gentle workings of grace. For Augustine's journey to Rome had been driven by ambition, and his move to Milan was fueled by equal measures of pride and hunger for opportunity. Yet beyond these visible motives, a deeper mystery was unfolding. He was being led, step by step, toward a teacher whose wisdom would become the first softening influence on his restless soul. And Monica, compelled by the quiet courage of her maternal vocation, now prepared to follow him once more, not because she wished to control his life, but because her prayers were pulling her toward the place where grace was already at work. This chapter, then, becomes the meeting of two paths that had long been diverging: Augustine's path toward intellectual brilliance and Monica's path toward spiritual fidelity. When Augustine arrived in Milan, he expected little more than professional advancement. Milan was a powerful city, bustling with political life and intellectual vigor. It was the residence of the emperor, a center of philosophical discussion, and the perfect place for an ambitious young rhetorician to make his name known. Augustine was appointed to a prestigious teaching position, an honor that delighted him. His skills were recognized, his eloquence admired, and he quickly became part of the intellectual circles he had long envied from afar. For a time, his pride swelled. It seemed that Rome's disappointments had been replaced by Milan's opportunities, that his dreams were finally taking shape. Yet despite these outward successes, Augustine's inner life remained troubled. He still adhered to Manichaeism, the philosophy that promised to explain the existence of evil, but left his heart unfulfilled. He attended gatherings of its teachers, but their arguments, once dazzling, now felt repetitive and hollow. His restless search for truth had not been satisfied. He felt a strange weariness that no intellectual achievement could dispel. It was as though something within him was calling for a deeper nourishment, a meaning he could not yet identify. It was during this inner unrest that Augustine first heard of Bishop Ambrose, the renowned spiritual leader of Milan. Ambrose was respected not only for his profound theological knowledge, but also for his extraordinary gentleness and compassion. His sermons attracted crowds who came not only to be instructed, but to be moved, challenged, and consoled. Augustine, curious but still resistant to Christianity, initially went to hear Ambrose not for faith, but for rhetorical admiration. He wanted to study Ambrose's speaking style, to learn from a man whose eloquence was known throughout the empire. But something unexpected happened. Though he went seeking rhetorical skill, he found himself drawn, against his own resistance, to the truth within the words. At first, Augustine listened as an observer, analyzing the cadence of Ambrose's voice, the clarity of his arguments, the precision of his language. But Ambrose's sermons carried something deeper, something that slid past Augustine's intellectual defenses and touched a place he did not expect. Ambrose spoke with a sincerity that made the scriptures come alive in a way Augustine had never experienced. The bishop addressed questions Augustine had wrestled with, questions about evil, suffering, and the nature of the human heart, and he answered them with warmth, humility, and wisdom rather than arrogance or scorn. Augustine found himself returning week after week, drawn by a mixture of admiration and wonder. Something in him recognized a truth he had once dismissed, and though he did not yet believe, the hardness around his soul began to soften as gently as ice melts under sunlight. Meanwhile, in Tagaste, Monica's heart was restless. She knew Augustine had left Rome for Milan, and once again the distance between them tore at her. Yet she felt an inner prompting, a sense that she was meant to follow him once more. She prayed for guidance, asking God whether she should undertake the long and difficult journey. The answer came not through dramatic visions, but through a persistent peace that settled into her heart each time she imagined traveling to Milan. And so, with courage that can only be born from love, she set out. The journey across the Mediterranean was not easy for a woman of her age, nor for someone who carried so much emotional weight. The sea could be treacherous, storms unpredictable, and travel arrangements uncertain. Yet Monica pressed forward, trusting that the God who had sustained her thus far would carry her still. Those who observed her during the voyage often remarked on her serenity. She spoke little, but prayed much. At night, when the waves slapped rhythmically against the hull of the ship, she sat awake, whispering Augustine's name into the darkness, confident that her prayers were not lost to the wind. When she arrived in Milan, weary but resolute, she found Augustine changed, not yet in faith, but in demeanor. The sharp defiance that once colored his every reaction had softened. The rebellious pride that once mocked her warnings now seemed tempered by a quiet humility he did not yet recognize in himself. He welcomed her warmly, perhaps with a hint of guilt, but also with genuine affection. He told her about Ambrose, about the sermons that stirred him, about questions he could no longer ignore. Monica, hearing the bishop's name, felt a wave of gratitude. She immediately sought him out, drawn to him not only as a great teacher, but as a shepherd who might one day gather her wandering son. Ambrose, for his part, admired Monica deeply. He saw in her an extraordinary devotion, a tenderness of spirit, a perseverance that could only be sustained by grace. He listened to her concerns with patience, offered counsel with fatherly warmth, and welcomed her to join the Christian community in Milan. Monica, who had always been faithful, now felt her spiritual life deepen further. She fasted regularly, attended daily services, and spent much of her time in acts of charity, visiting the sick, comforting the suffering, and supporting the church through humble service. Her days in Milan became a kind of pilgrimage, a journey lived not on roads, but in the heart. As she watched Augustine attend Ambrose's sermons, she sensed a quiet transformation unfolding within him. He no longer argued so fiercely against Christianity. He questioned his own beliefs more humbly. He admitted moments of moral struggle, of spiritual fatigue, of longing for something he could not name. Monica saw in these signs the slow but steady approach of grace. She did not press him, did not lecture him, did not demand sudden change. She had learned that hearts are not conquered by force but opened by love. Instead, she watched, prayed, and waited. And as this chapter draws to its gentle close, mother and son, once separated by oceans, pride, and pain, now find themselves living in the same city, listening to the same bishop, surrounded by the same quiet workings of God. Augustine stands on the threshold of a transformation he does not yet fully understand, while Monica stands at his side, the lighthouse whose steady glow has guided him through years of storm. The question now lingers softly. What happens when grace, long invited, finally begins to break through the cracks of a wandering heart? And so, from the moment Augustine first began to sit under the preaching of Bishop Ambrose, his sharp intellect slowly yielding to a gentler wisdom, his restless heart softening almost despite itself, the story enters a quieter, more contemplative chapter. It is a chapter shaped not by dramatic events, but by a gradual interior awakening, the kind that unfolds like dawn spreading across a dim horizon. Augustine did not convert suddenly, nor was he swept into faith by a single revelation. His transformation was slow, layered, complex, a journey of hesitations, discoveries, resistances, and moments of quiet illumination. And at the center of it all, steadfast as ever, stood Monica, now living in Milan, watching grace move in her son with the patience of one who has prayed too long to doubt the faithfulness of God. Life in Milan took on a new rhythm for both mother and son. Augustine continued teaching rhetoric, earning admiration from students and colleagues alike, yet his intellectual pursuits began to feel strangely hollow. The philosophies that once dazzled him now rang with a faint emptiness. Manichaeism, his long-time spiritual shelter, no longer satisfied the deeper questions stirring within him. Its teachers faltered when pressed. Its explanations of good and evil, once so compelling, now felt simplistic. He found himself yearning for something more profound, something that resonated not only with his mind, but with the deeper longing of his spirit. It was during this time that the sermons of Ambrose began to penetrate Augustine's inner defenses. He went at first merely to admire the bishop's eloquence, taking mental notes on style and delivery, yet gradually the content of the sermons captured him more than the technique. Ambrose spoke of Scripture with a depth and nuance Augustine had never encountered. He explained the Old Testament not as crude stories of a vengeful God, as the Manichaeans claimed, but as mysteries revealing spiritual truths. He approached the complexities of suffering and moral struggle with compassion, acknowledging the depth of human weakness while pointing always to the mercy of God. Augustine found himself listening with a growing openness, even admiration. He could not yet believe, but he could no longer dismiss. Meanwhile, Monica settled comfortably into Milan's Christian community. Her days were marked by prayer, fasting, and acts of charity. She spent mornings in the basilica, afternoons visiting the sick and poor, evenings in quiet reflection. But she was not a woman withdrawn from the world. She was gentle, sociable, capable of warmth that drew others toward her. Many in Milan admired her serenity, her generosity, the quiet strength that radiated from her. She became a familiar figure in the church, always present, always praying, always supporting the work of Ambrose with simple yet unwavering faith. Ambrose himself came to cherish her presence. He saw in Monica a rare combination of humility and strength, a woman whose prayers carried weight not because of eloquence, but because of love. He often spoke kindly with her after services, offering guidance and comfort, encouraging her to continue trusting that God was at work in Augustine even when progress seemed slow. Monica, for her part, listened to Ambrose with gratitude. His wisdom gave her courage. His gentle authority helped her navigate her hopes and fears with renewed peace. Augustine, observing his mother's devotion, felt a kind of awe toward her faith. Though he resisted embracing it, he could not deny its power. He saw how prayer shaped her character, how it gave her a joy that no hardship could extinguish. He saw how she never grew bitter, never retaliated, never allowed disappointment to harden her. Something in her fidelity began speaking to him more loudly than any argument. He did not say this aloud, for pride still guarded his heart, but the influence moved silently within him. During this period, Augustine's intellectual journey took an unexpected turn. He began reading the works of Platonist philosophers, authors who spoke of eternal truth and spiritual realities with a depth that thrilled him. Their writings awakened in him a vision of divinity that transcended the material world. These ideas, though not Christian, brought him closer to the concept of a God who was not bound by physical substance, a God who was pure goodness, pure truth, pure beauty. This philosophical awakening opened a door within Augustine that Manichaeism had kept shut. It allowed him to imagine, perhaps for the first time, that Christianity might not be intellectually inferior after all. Still, he resisted conversion. His mind wavered between truths he sensed but did not fully grasp. He felt torn between his desires and his longing for meaning. He feared the discipline that Christianity demanded. He feared giving up the pleasures that had become habitual. He feared the vulnerability of surrender. And underlying all these fears was the reality of his personal relationships, his long-standing companion, the mother of his son. He loved her deeply, though their union lacked the sacramental bond Monica longed for. The thought of giving her up pained him, and he could not imagine embracing a faith that demanded such sacrifice. Monica, aware of these complexities, did not pressure him. She knew that grace must move at its own pace. Instead, she continued to surround him with quiet support. She invited him to meals with fellow believers, introduced him to friends whose lives reflected Christian virtue, and maintained a presence so gentle that it softened him without forcing him. At the same time, she prayed that God would guide him through every obstacle in his heart, especially those bound to desire. There were evenings when Augustine, weary from the turmoil within him, would sit with his mother and speak candidly. He confessed his uncertainties, his philosophical struggles, his longing for truth mixed with fear of commitment. Monica listened patiently, offering neither judgment nor simplistic solutions. She simply affirmed that God was near, that God saw his struggle, that God would not abandon him. Her calm presence soothed him. It reminded him of a stability he had lost long ago. Yet even as Augustine drew closer to truth, he felt the grip of temptation tighten. He spoke later of this period as one in which he stood on the threshold of conversion, able to see the beauty of faith, but still unable to let go of the chains that bound him. "Give me chastity and continence," he prayed silently, "but not yet." His heart was divided, half drawn toward the light, half clinging to the shadows. Ambrose, recognizing this interior tension, continued guiding him gently. The bishop did not push Augustine toward conversion, but offered insights that helped him wrestle honestly with his questions. Their conversations, sometimes long, sometimes brief, became important moments in Augustine's journey. Ambrose modeled a faith rooted not in fear, but in reason, not in coercion, but in love. Through him, Augustine encountered a Christianity that could withstand the scrutiny of the mind and satisfy the longing of the heart. Meanwhile, the Christian community of Milan was preparing for Easter, a season of renewal and rebirth. The catechumens, those preparing for baptism, attended instruction and prayer with growing anticipation. Augustine watched them with a curiosity he did not fully understand. Their faces carried a serenity unlike anything he had known. Something in him longed for that peace. And as this chapter draws to a close, we find Augustine suspended between two worlds, the world of his past with its pleasures and philosophies, and the world of grace which beckoned him gently, insistently. Monica, steadfast as sunrise, continued her vigil, knowing that the moment of surrender was drawing near. And in the quiet tension of this threshold, the question emerges softly. What happens when a longing for truth finally becomes stronger than the fear of surrender? And so, from the gentle dawn of Augustine's interior awakening, his admiration for Ambrose, his philosophical stirrings, his growing weariness of worldly pursuits, the story moves now into its most tender and transformative chapter, the long-awaited turning of a wandering heart toward the God who'd been quietly pursuing him for years. This is the chapter where Monica's tears meet their purpose, where Augustine's restless longing finally collides with grace, and where the tangled threads of desire, pride, love, and fear begin to untangle beneath the warm light of conversion. Yet this movement of the heart, though decisive, was not sudden. It unfolded through struggle, collapse, surrender, and finally peace, a peace so profound that it would become one of the most cherished moments in the history of Christian spirituality. By this time in Milan, the weight of Augustine's inner conflict had grown overwhelming. He could no longer hide from himself the truth he sensed, that the life he had built, rooted in ambition, passion, and pride, was no longer enough. The pleasures he had once embraced now left him empty. His philosophical pursuits, though stimulating, could not soothe the ache inside him. Even the rhetoric he had mastered felt hollow, a tool of persuasion rather than a path to meaning. Something within him was breaking, not through violence, but through the slow erosion of illusions he had clung to for years. The more he listened to Ambrose, the more he felt the old beliefs of Manichaeism dissolving. Their claims no longer made sense. Their cosmology felt shallow. Their insistence on blaming evil on external darkness rather than human choice now seemed childish. Yet even as these intellectual barriers fell away, a deeper obstacle remained: Augustine's own desires. He feared that embracing Christianity would require him to relinquish the passions that had shaped his identity. He feared giving up the companion he loved, the mother of his child. He feared letting go of ambitions that promised worldly success. And he feared most of all the vulnerability of admitting that he needed grace. His turmoil reached a new intensity when a friend of his, Pontitianus, visited him and spoke of the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert, a man who had given up everything to pursue God with total devotion. Augustine listened with growing discomfort as Pontitianus described how some young men, reading the story of Anthony, had instantly abandoned their worldly lives to follow Christ. Augustine felt pierced by this tale. Why, he wondered, did others find the courage he lacked? Why did he hesitate when the truth was clear before him? Why could he admire their surrender, yet remain paralyzed by his own fears? This conversation left him shaken, unable to escape the realization that something within him was resisting, not because the faith was untrue, but because surrender felt too costly. The struggle reached its breaking point one afternoon in a quiet garden near the home he shared with friends. Augustine had been speaking with Alypius, his loyal companion, about the turmoil within him, confessing that he felt torn between two wills, one pulling him toward God, the other chained to his old life. His voice trembled with frustration as he described the misery of being trapped between desire and conscience. He felt as though he stood on the edge of a precipice, able to see the beauty of the land beyond, yet terrified to leap. He argued with himself, rebuked himself, shamed himself, and at last, overwhelmed by despair, he fled from Alypius and sought a secluded corner of the garden. There, beneath the canopy of fig leaves, his struggle erupted into tears. "How long, O Lord?" he cried within his heart. "Why not now? Why not this moment put an end to my indecencies?" He felt as though the weight of his past, every sin, every misstep, every moment of pride, pressed upon him like a burden too heavy to bear. He fell to the ground, trembling, sobbing, unable to contain the anguish that had been building within him for years. It was a breaking, but it was also a birth. As he wept, a sound reached his ears, a child's voice, faint yet clear, chanting a phrase repeatedly, "Take and read, take and read." Augustine froze, his breath caught between wonder and confusion. Was it a child playing in a nearby house? Was it something else? He did not know, but he recognized the words as a divine prompting, a call to open the scriptures. He rose, wiped his tears, and returned to Alypius. On a small table nearby lay a copy of St. Paul's letters. His hands trembled as he opened it at random and read the words that would change the course of his life. Not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lust and debauchery, not in rivalry and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh. The moment he finished the sentence, the turmoil vanished. It did not fade gradually. It disappeared as though a heavy curtain had been lifted from his soul. A lightness entered him, a clarity, a peace he had never known. He closed the book, breathing deeply, his heart calm for the first time in years. Alypius, seeing his transformation, opened the text and encountered a message meant for him as well. And in that quiet garden, beneath the fig tree whose leaves had sheltered Augustine's tears, two souls turned toward God. News of Augustine's decision soon reached Monica, and though she had prayed for this moment for decades, the reality of it overwhelmed her. When Augustine told her, she looked at him with an expression that carried years of longing, grief, and hope condensed into a single breath. Her tears flowed not with sorrow now, but with unimaginable joy. She raised her hands in gratitude, praising the God who had turned her mourning into rejoicing. Ambrose, when he learned of Augustine's desire to be baptized, welcomed him with the gladness of a shepherd rejoicing over a lost sheep returned. Augustine withdrew from public life for a time, spending months in quiet reflection. He resigned from his post as a teacher of rhetoric, a decision that cost him greatly in worldly terms but freed him spiritually. He devoted himself to prayer, scripture, and preparation for baptism. Monica joined him during this season, supporting him with the tenderness of a mother whose long vigil had finally given way to dawn. Together with a small group of friends, Augustine traveled to a nearby estate called Cassiciacum, where he spent the winter in contemplation, writing, conversing, and strengthening his newfound faith. Finally, on the radiant night of the Easter Vigil, Augustine descended into the waters of baptism at the hands of Ambrose. The basilica was filled with light from candles held by the faithful, their glow reflected in the stillness of the baptismal font. Monica stood among them, tears streaming down her face, her heart overflowing with thanksgiving. Her son, once lost in pride and pleasure, now stood clothed in white, a new creation. The moment was not merely symbolic. It was the flowering of a prayer decades in the making, the fulfillment of a promise whispered to her in dreams, the answer to every tear she had poured out before God. As this chapter draws gently to a close, mother and son stand side by side in the soft glow of Easter, bound not only by family ties, but now by a shared faith. The long arc of wandering has bent at last toward grace, and the miracle Monica long believed in has finally come to pass. And as the waters settle, one cannot help but ask quietly, what new journey begins for a soul once lost, now found, and what peace awaits a mother who has lived to see her deepest prayer fulfilled? And so, from the luminous night of Easter, when Augustine emerged from the waters of baptism, his heart washed clean, his future redirected, his mother's tears transformed into quiet triumph. The story moves into the tender and contemplative season that followed, a time when mother and son walked together in a peace they had never known before. Gone were the anxious prayers that once kept Monica awake through endless nights, gone the restless arguments, the long silences, the painful misunderstandings. For the first time since Augustine's boyhood, their spirits were joined not only by affection, but by a shared love for God. And this new unity brought with it a sweetness that made every moment precious, for Monica sensed, with the serene intuition of one nearing the end of her earthly journey, that her mission was nearly complete. After his baptism, Augustine withdrew from public life, determined to leave behind the ambitions that had once consumed him. He had become a man whose desires were no longer centered on worldly success, but on understanding God's truth and living in harmony with it. He chose to give up his career as a rhetorician, recognizing how easily his eloquence could tempt him back into pride. He also renounced the romantic life he had shared for so long with the mother of his son, entrusting the child, Adeodatus, to God's care. This sacrifice cost him dearly, yet he embraced it with the awareness that conversion demands not only belief, but transformation. His heart, once divided, now sought wholeness. During this period of spiritual reorientation, Augustine lived in close companionship with Monica and a small group of friends. They spent their days in conversation, prayer, and reflection, forming a community marked by simplicity and contemplation. The air around them seemed quieter somehow, as though life itself had slowed to allow space for a deeper awakening. Augustine later described these days as some of the most beautiful of his life, filled with discussions on philosophy, virtue, scripture, and the mystery of God. And woven through it all was Monica's presence, steady, warm, encouraging, offering wisdom through silence as much as through words. But the sweetness of this season was not without sorrow. Monica understood that her son's return to faith marked the nearing of her own departure. Her life had been shaped almost entirely around the mission of guiding Augustine toward God. She had watched over him with unwavering love through childhood, adolescence, and his long years of wandering. Now that he had found his way home, she sensed her earthly purpose drawing to a gentle close. Yet this awareness filled her not with fear, but with peace, a peace so deep that it radiated from her like a soft glow. After the baptism, Augustine, Alypius, and Adeodatus made plans to return to Africa, where Augustine felt called to build a life of service and contemplation. Monica eagerly agreed to accompany them. The journey began with light hearts, the travelers moving slowly southward, stopping in towns along the Italian coast. Their destination was the port of Ostia, where they would wait for a ship to carry them across the Mediterranean. It was there, in this quiet harbor town, that Monica and Augustine shared a final, unforgettable moment, a moment often remembered as one of the most tender scenes in Christian literature. One afternoon, while the others rested or tended to practical matters, Monica and Augustine sat together at a window overlooking a garden. The air was still, the sunlight soft, and a quiet joy filled the room. They began speaking of the life to come, not the journey to Africa, but the eternal life promised by God. Their conversation moved beyond earthly matters to the contemplation of heaven, the nature of the soul, the joy of union with God. Augustine described this moment later with reverence, recalling how their dialogue lifted their hearts above all earthly realities. Words flowed between them with a natural grace, and for a brief, sacred time, it felt as though their souls were touching the very threshold of eternity. They wondered aloud what it would be like to leave behind the weight of the body, to rise into a joy unshadowed by sorrow, to see God not through the veil of earthly life, but in direct clarity. Their minds soared, not through pride, but through love. And in that moment, it seemed to both of them that heaven was not a distant dream, but a presence already near, gently inviting them to rest in its embrace. It was during this contemplative exchange that Monica spoke words Augustine would never forget. "For my part, I have no further desire for anything in this life. What I am doing here any longer and why I am still here I do not know. All my hopes in this world are now fulfilled." Her voice carried no sadness, only peace. She looked at Augustine with eyes that had wept every kind of tear, tears of fear, of anguish, of longing, and now of joy, for she had lived to see her deepest prayer answered, lived to witness her son embrace the God she had loved so fiercely. She had watched him rise from the shadows into the light, watched the grace she trusted finally wrap itself around him. In that moment, she felt that her life had fulfilled its purpose. Shortly afterward, Monica fell ill. At first, her companions hoped it was a minor sickness brought on by travel, but she knew otherwise. She told them gently not to worry about burial arrangements, remarking with calm certainty that the place of her body mattered little, for nothing is far from God. Augustine was shaken, for the thought of losing her seemed unbearable. Yet even as tears filled his eyes, he could not deny the serenity that radiated from her. Her heart was steady, her faith unwavering. She had spent her life bringing others to God. Now she was ready to return to Him. Her final days were marked by an extraordinary tranquility. Those who tended to her remarked on the peace that filled the room, a peace almost tangible, as though heaven itself had drawn near to accompany her. Augustine remained by her side constantly, praying, listening, remembering every sacrifice she had made for him. He later confessed that his grief was immense, but it was softened by the knowledge that she died as she had lived, in faith, humility, and love. When the moment of her passing came, it was gentle. Her breath slowed, her eyes softened, and her spirit rose like dawn breaking over calm waters. Augustine stood beside her, holding her hand, whispering prayers of gratitude. And though his heart ached, he felt within himself the same peace she had carried, a peace that came not from absence, but from fulfillment. In the time that followed, Augustine mourned her deeply, yet he also felt strengthened by her memory. Her life became for him a guiding light, a model of perseverance and faith that he would carry into the many years of spiritual leadership ahead. He would become one of the greatest teachers in Christian history, not in spite of his wandering, but in part because of it. For in his story, people found hope that no soul is too lost for grace, no heart too hardened for God, no tears too many for heaven to hear. And as this chapter draws softly to its close, one realizes that the real legacy of St. Monica is not merely that she guided Augustine to God, but that she revealed through her life the mysterious power of love, the kind of love that prays without ceasing, forgives without bitterness, and hopes without surrender. And one cannot help but ask, what miracles might unfold in the world if more hearts loved with such quiet, unwavering devotion? And so, from the tender quiet of Monica's passing at Ostia, her final breath like a soft exhalation of peace, her earthly mission completed with a grace that left her son both grieving and strengthened, the story now moves into its closing chapter, where the ripples of her life continue outward long after her body is laid to rest. For the beauty of Monica's legacy is not found only in the tears she shed or the prayers she whispered, but in the enduring transformation her love awakened in Augustine, and through him, across centuries. This final chapter becomes not merely a farewell, but a reflection on the mystery of how one humble woman, through faith alone, changed the history of the Church. After Monica's death, the small circle of travelers mourned her with reverence. The arrangements in Ostia were simple, befitting the humility she had lived by. Augustine later wrote that he could barely contain his grief, yet even in the heaviness of sorrow, he felt a quiet assurance, an inner whisper that she was now exactly where she had always longed to be. The harbor town, with its still waters and quiet evenings, became for him a sacred place, a threshold where heaven had drawn near and taken her gently by the hand. He remained there for several days, not only to settle her affairs, but also to let his heart absorb the immensity of the moment. Her burial was far from the place she had imagined as a young woman, yet she had told her children not to worry about where she would rest, for no place is far from God. Her words became a comfort to Augustine, reminding him that the soil covering her body was but the beginning of her new life. He felt a tenderness whenever he recalled that final conversation at the window, the two of them contemplating heaven together. It seemed fitting to him that she should pass at a port, a place of departure, as though her life's voyage had at last reached its eternal shore. With time, Augustine and his companions continued their journey to Africa. The sea crossing, once filled with youthful ambition, now felt like a pilgrimage. Augustine traveled not as the man he had once been, a rhetorical teacher seeking applause, but as one newly reborn, carrying both the weight of his mother's memory and the lightness of his newfound faith. He had no grand plans for himself, only a deep desire to live in truth, to serve God, to use his gifts in a way that would honor the prayers that had carried him to this point. Upon returning to Tagaste, Augustine chose a life of simplicity. He sold much of his inheritance, giving generously to the poor, and formed a small community devoted to prayer, study, and charity. It was during this period that he wrote some of his earliest reflections, works shaped by his fresh devotion and his desire to share the beauty of the faith he had once resisted. Monica's influence was alive in every page. not only in the tender references he made to her, but in the spirit of humility that permeated his writing. In time, Augustine was ordained a priest in Hippo, though he accepted the calling reluctantly, feeling unworthy of such responsibility. His reluctance did not arise from pride, but from a profound awareness of the weight such a role carried. Yet the people saw in him a wisdom and sincerity that made him a natural shepherd. His sermons soon drew crowds, not because of the eloquence he had once been so proud of, but because of the sincerity and depth that now shaped every word he spoke. His past struggles allowed him to speak to the wounded with compassion, to the lost with understanding, to the seekers with clarity. Eventually, Augustine became Bishop of Hippo, a role he fulfilled for more than 30 years. His leadership was marked by tireless pastoral care, deep theological insight, and a love for truth that inspired those around him. He confronted heresies, guided the faithful, defended the church against error, and wrote extensively on the mysteries of faith, works that continue to shape Christian thought today. Among his writings, none is more famous than his Confessions, a profound account of his journey from sin to grace, a journey made possible through the prayers of his mother. Throughout this period, Monica's memory remained a source of strength for him. He spoke often of her in his sermons, not to glorify her, but to illustrate the quiet power of holy perseverance. She became, in his preaching, a model for parents, for spouses, for anyone who loved someone wandering far from God. Augustine knew that his life's transformation had been planted, watered, and brought to fruition by Monica's relentless love. His words about her were not sentimental, but deeply truthful. She had not been a woman of great learning, nor did she hold any position of earthly honor. Yet her greatness lay in her fidelity, a fidelity stronger than Augustine's pride, stronger than the allure of vice, stronger than every obstacle that had risen between them. In Confessions, Augustine described her life with a tenderness that reveals how deeply he understood her sacrifices. He wrote of her tears, tears God counted, tears God did not ignore. He wrote of her patience, her gentle refusals to abandon hope, her ability to speak truth without crushing the heart. He wrote of her dream, the promise she clung to, the bishop's prophetic assurance that the son of so many tears would not perish. And he wrote of her death with a sorrow that had softened into gratitude, saying that she had loved him more fiercely and faithfully than he had loved himself. Her story, carried forward through Augustine's writings, spread across the Christian world. Monica became known not merely as the mother of a saint, but as a saint in her own right, a woman whose holiness was shaped not by extraordinary miracles, but by the miracle of a love that would not give up. Over time, she became a patron for those who pray for loved ones, for mothers who watch their children wander, for anyone who perseveres through sorrow in the hope of redemption. Churches were named in her honor, prayers composed in her memory, pilgrimages made to the places where she lived, prayed, and died. And through it all, her story continued to inspire countless hearts, reminding them that no tear is wasted, no prayer unheard. Augustine, too, carried her legacy in his heart until the end of his life. He became one of the greatest doctors of the Church, shaping theology for centuries to come. Yet even in his most brilliant theological works, traces of his mother remain, her humility reflected in his sermons on grace, her tenderness in his writings on charity, her perseverance in his reflections on the spiritual life. Her love became the unseen foundation of his greatness, the quiet grace beneath his brilliance. And as this final chapter draws to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of two extraordinary lives, one marked by restless seeking, the other by steadfast love, and realizing that the miracle of their story lies not only in Augustine's conversion, but in the mysterious collaboration between divine grace and a mother's longing. Monica's tears became Augustine's path. Augustine's transformation became the Church's treasure. and their combined legacy continues to whisper across the centuries, a truth that comforts the weary and strengthens the faithful, that love, when joined to prayer, has the power to shape destinies beyond anything we can imagine. And perhaps the quietest question that arises at the end of their intertwined journeys is this: how many hidden Monicas, unknown to history, continue even now to change the world through the tears they offer and the faith they refuse to surrender?